Good morning to everyone here at CSIS, and good morning to those who are watching online. We sometimes have more people online than we do in the audience. My name is Michael Matera. I'm the director of the Americas Program here at CSIS. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here this morning. For those of you who are joining us for the first time and don't know CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies is one of the leading foreign and public policy think tanks in the United States. Our Americas Program is a small team of staff members and a broad group of senior associates and senior advisors, all of us committed to raising the profile of the Americas region. Through a diverse program of research and presentations like the one that we're doing here this morning, we're trying to contribute to the debate and to the public's understanding of the importance of the Western Hemisphere to our own country. An important part of this effort over our first year of activities has been a special focus on the Caribbean and the many issues that our country shares with those countries across what we sometimes refer to as the third border, the Caribbean Sea. We share issues of trade, immigration, security, education, health challenges, and many others. There are, of course, the issues of the dynamic Caribbean diaspora that has made such an important contribution to the culture, the economy, the prosperity of the United States. We have a committed team led by George Farriol, David Lewis. We have Sally Yearwood of CCAA involved, Gustavo Arnavat, Ken Frankel, and Nikki Gazarian, one of our staff members who's been holding up the Caribbean operation this first year. We are just now finishing our first full year with this, and we're marking it with this event today and the publication a few weeks ago of this report on U.S. Caribbean relations. We carried out this study in response to a special request that we got from a number of congressional staffers and State Department officials who are engaged on the Caribbean in the wake of the passage late last year of H.R. 4939. You will hear from the authors of the report and from George and David in a few minutes. But first, we have the honor to present two key policy players on the Caribbean, one of them from Congress and the other from the executive branch. U.S. Representative Adriano Espaillat is a proud member of the Dominican diaspora, the first Dominican-American to serve in the U.S. Congress. He represents New York's 13th Congressional District and was sworn into office a little more than 6 months ago. The congressman was born in the Dominican Republic and came to the United States with his family when he was 9 years old. He grew up in New York City. Congressman Espaillat currently serves as a member of the very important U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee, the House Committee on Education and the Workforce, and the House Select Committee on Small Business. He's also a member of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. The congressman will begin with some remarks. We'll take a few questions from the audience after that. And before calling the congressman to the podium, I'd also like to acknowledge the presence here this morning of the former president of the Dominican Republic, Leonel Fernandez, here in the first row. We had the honor to receive the former president yesterday here at CSIS. His very distinguished foundation in the Dominican Republic has had a long relationship with CSIS that we are renewing or will be renewing in the coming months. But so without further ado, I'd like to call the congressman up to the podium. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure for me to be here. As was mentioned, I represent the 13th Congressional District in New York City. It is an iconic congressional district. It's only being represented by two members of Congress. First, the late and great Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., who represented this district for over 20 years, having been the first African-American from New York State to serve in Congress, and for the last 46 years, it was represented by Charles B. Rangel. So for the last 75 years, it has only been represented by two members of Congress, both of which have left their mark in this city, and both of which have been great advocates for the district, which now not only encompasses Harlem and East Harlem and the northern part of Manhattan that includes Washington Heights, where you have the big concentration of the Dominican diaspora, but also the Northwest Bronx. So it's a global district that you have immigrants from Albania, from Vietnam, from West Africa, from Senegal, from Mexico, obviously from the Dominican Republic, Soviet Jews. You have also a great presence of families that were World War II Jewish settlers in northern Manhattan. It is the district that saw Henry Kissinger grow up. So it's a very diverse district and a global district with people from all over the world. And so one of my first priorities when I got here to Congress this January was to be a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee because of the dynamic that occurs there, particularly the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, which I am a member of as well. And so I am happy to be here with you today to speak about, I think, a very important topic, and that is our relationship with the Caribbean. And for some time, our relationship with the Caribbean, in my opinion, has been lacking focus. We've seen, I'm happy to share with you that just recently I've commissioned the Government Accountability Office to study and assess the impact of the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, which is an initiative funded to deal directly with security issues in that region. And just yesterday I got the confirmation from the GAO that they will in fact be conducting this study to assess the actual productivity, the success of this particular initiative. And I think it's very indicative that the changing tides and the need to pay, there's a need to pay more attention to the U.S. Caribbean relations, right? As was mentioned earlier, the Caribbean is often mentioned as the third border, right? And so we're so close to it. It's a hop, skip, and a jump. Traditionally, immigrant groups that came to America, particularly through Ellis Islands, never went back to their country of origin. And so they assimilated easier into mainstream culture. But in the last 30, 40 years, it has been easier to go back and forth to the countries that you came from. And therefore, the roots are kept very much alive with those nations. And the diaspora has a constant interaction with those countries, way beyond the remittances that many of these countries receive, that often play an important role in their local economies. The cultural, social component of these interactions remains very much alive. And so it is important that we continue to focus our efforts and our commitment to this region, to the third border. And the countries of the Caribbean, which include the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and the smaller islands, are so important not only because of their geopolitical condition, their proximity to the United States, but also the role that many of the diasporas of this country play in our country. And so this is important that we continue to support them. There are challenges, obviously, in these nations. The State Department's multi-year strategic plan referred to the Caribbean, as I say, as a third border, and it emphasized the need to strengthen our mutual national security and the need to curb the trafficking and smuggling of illicit goods and people. This is where I think the funding for the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative should be at, and we must continue to vigorously support this initiative. For our national security, we cannot afford to cut CBSI funding. It's deeply troubling to me to see how the current administration have proposed a 37% cut in this particular program. While I'm pushing to reject this cut, along with many other dangerous cuts proposed by the current administration in Foreign Service and in the State Department. Even General Mattis said that if we cut funding to the State Department, we have to purchase more bullets. And so it is important that we continue to fund these initiatives and not move back for it. Thankfully, the House Appropriations Committee chose to disregard this proposal in their budget and provides a $57.7 million funding stream for CBSI for the fiscal year 18. So it still needs a lot to be desired, but I think it is important that we continue to support these initiatives. Let me first begin by addressing some of the challenges of some of the countries and governments in the region. Puerto Rico, which is a neighboring island, continues to face major economic problems. We see a major exodus of professionals, particularly to the central Florida region, Texas, and other southern states. It is sort of like a brain drain exodus of some of the most productive members of that society. And so the economy in Puerto Rico continues to face great challenges. Congress approved PROMESA, which is an initiative that has implemented a financial control board that has certain obligations, and Puerto Rico continues to face a major economic crisis. Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez and myself, which both sit on the Small Business Committee, are doing whatever we can to see how we can inject oxygen into the small business community in Puerto Rico. We have asked the Small Business Administration, headed by Linda McMahon, who recently traveled to Puerto Rico, to recommend some initiatives to jumpstart the small business economy in the island, recognizing that small businesses continue to be the biggest employers across the United States and in Puerto Rico as well. But Puerto Rico has with it great attributes. It has a solid infrastructure. It has a very trained and professional labor force. Puerto Rico has the American know-how. It has great opportunities to bounce back and meet its financial obligations. But we must work closer with Puerto Rico to ensure that they overcome this crisis that impacts the entire Caribbean region as well. Cuba and Caribbean tourism propose a great opportunity in the future. We also believe that the people of Puerto Rico can benefit from, and the people from the Dominican Republic can benefit from the potential of emerging tourism in the island of Cuba. Congress has historically played an active role in the trade policy in Cuba, from the 1960s trade embargoes to Obama's 2014 policy of normalization of relations with Cuba to the recent Trump policy in June. Cuba continues to be a crucial part of our dialogue, and it has a brand name that has, I think, international appeal. And so for tourism and investment, Cuba continues to be potentially in the future a great avenue. It has also a good trained and educated workforce. It lacks perhaps a strong infrastructure and doesn't have the financial systems that will lend themselves currently to development, but I think it has great potential. The Dominican Republic, which has seen a consistent growth in its GDP of anywhere from 5 to 7%, also provides great opportunities for the region. It has, as I said, a strong financing sector that allows for investment to go to the island. It still has some challenges with its infrastructure and energy, but it has seen in the last 20 to 30 years enormous growth in those areas as well. So these are three islands, three Antillas, that I think are joined at the hip, if you may, historically and also in practical terms, joined at the hip, and it requires a regional approach to address many of their problems. Some of their common problems are, for example, energy. The cost of energy in Puerto Rico is very, very expensive. It's crucial, and it's right at the center also of their economic crisis. Dominican Republic continues to face challenges as they strive to resolve their energy problems in the island that will facilitate greater investment. And Cuba, of course, also faces great challenges with energy. So energy continues to be an area where perhaps the region could work together to resolve this problem holistically. The other area are natural disasters. Unfortunately, the Caribbean stands on the path of natural disasters. We should work closer together as a region to develop a protocol that would address these natural disasters, the results of these natural disasters in each of these islands. We saw the devastation that the earthquake in Haiti caused. Haiti is still attempting to lift itself from that dramatic tragedy that impacted the entire world. So these are areas where we can very much work together in security. National security for the United States and regional security. As the United States looks to strengthen its borders, it is potentially feasible that drug trafficking, human trafficking, and other illegal activities will go to countries in the region with fragile borders that don't have the resources to ensure that we will keep those nations safe, as well as our nation here in the United States. So these are areas where we feel we can work together. It requires greater emphasis from our nation, from the United States, a refocus on the region. Many of the political difficulties have occurred because we've turned our head, if you may, for some years, and we'd allowed a vacuum of leadership to fester. I think that the United States should go back to its leadership role in the region, work with the region to ensure that many of its common problems are addressed regionally, to provide the resources for human development, education, healthcare, infrastructure is all very important for the region. Tourism is at the center of the Caribbean. All of these nations provide great opportunities for that part of the economy. Remittances will be a thing of the past in countries like the Dominican Republic. It is a generational dynamic that as we move forward, we will see that my children and grandchildren probably will not send any money back home. Their second and third generation of those immigrant families will not send back home money the way they did in previous decades. Forcing those governments to reinvent themselves, to re-engage the diaspora in a different dynamic, perhaps in re-engaging the young professionals from that diaspora, the U.S.-born young professional from that diaspora, to invest in those countries. And so this is a major challenge. I think it's a challenge of the future, but one that I think that our nation, the United States of America, must take very seriously, as we all know that the Caribbean is our third voter. Thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity, and I'll take any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Congressman. So we very much appreciate those comments.
Thank you.
We agree with you on the need to refocus attention on the Caribbean, and to the degree that we, from here at CSIS, can assist in that process, we're there to collaborate.
Thank you.
With you and with the executive. We have time for just a few questions before the congressman needs to run off back to the Hill for a committee markup.
Yes.
David. Yes, we have someone with a mic. And if you could please identify yourself and keep your questions short.
Thank you. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. David Lewis with Manchester Trade and Senior Associate here at CSIS. Your office issued a press release earlier this week about a CODEL that you will be joining to the region. I believe it includes Dominican Republic and
tomorrow, yes.
Haiti. Well, could you give us some more details on that, and what are the prospects for that? Thank you.
Well, the Western Hemisphere subcommittee, of which I am a member, will be flying out to the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Colombia, and Peru starting tomorrow evening. And we will be joined by, I will be joined by 7 other congressional members, including the chair and the ranking member of the subcommittee, Duncan and CSIS. And so we will be engaging the governments in those nations on issues of very important relevancy to the region, and including the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And so we hope to come back with a good report for all of you.
Congressman, a pleasure. Buenos dias. Maria Luisa Boyce with UPS. Thank you so much for your remarks. Maybe as you're getting ready for the trip, one of the questions, you see the region in Latin America is converging a lot with the Pacific Alliance, and of course we have still the implementation of the CAFTA-DR agreement. How do you see those agreements playing in the future for the region as we engage on the NAFTA conversations, but I think that is going to send a trend for e-commerce or other trade changes that are going to happen in the region. So I'll be curious to see if you're going to touch some of those topics in the trip and your thoughts. Thank you.
Well, we will touch on trade and security, but again, this current administration is looking to recalibrate, if I may use that term, those agreements. I think that it provides also an opportunity to change any of the challenges that those agreements place on our countries, the competitive challenges. I know that the Dominican Republic and the DR CAFTA agreement had to really focus for a long time to be able to be competitive and see the fruits of that agreement. And I think now we have an opportunity to tweak that, to make some changes, to allow for the host countries of those agreements to benefit even more. I think that it is important that we refocus our efforts and see what went wrong and what could be changed as we move forward. And obviously, this administration wants to ensure that these agreements benefit more our workforce here, our economy. And so that will be something that will be looked at as they move forward. And we will be, obviously, from Congress, we will be monitoring the whole entire situation, yes.
I see 2 questions here. Could you take both questions together?
Good morning, Congressman. I'm Robert Balk with the State University of New York. SUNY is engaged in a lot of countries of the Caribbean right now, particularly in Haiti. Mm-hmm. We are the first U.S. university to have an agreement with the Ministry of Higher Education of Cuba, and we have an important system relationship with the University of the West Indies. I'm just curious what you see is the role and can be the role of higher education right now in your engagements with the Caribbean.
Well, I'm glad that you asked, because I am planning a trip with H. Carl McCall and SUNY to the Dominican Republic in the last weeks of August of this coming month, particularly to discuss the potential of having a greater presence of SUNY in the Dominican Republic, as they do already in Haiti and in Cuba. And so I think that we met with Carl McCall, and I was surprised. We often just meet with the CUNY officials, the City University of New York, and we know there's over 25,000 students of Dominican descent in the City University of New York, which are basically the new middle class of New York, tomorrow's middle class in making. And I was pleasantly surprised to hear that also SUNY has about 9,000 students of Dominican descent, and they come from all over the world, really. And so you have a lot of expertise to offer. I know that you have on several of your campuses, you have special centers of excellence for agriculture, for technology, for any gamut of the economy that I think a country like the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Jamaica, any country in the Caribbean, Haiti could really benefit from. So I hope to further foster the relationships between the academic institutions of those countries and the state of New York.
Buenos días, congresista.
Buenos días.
Max Trujillo from MJT Policy, a government relations firm here in Washington. I wanted to ask you, in the past, whenever, particularly in the issue of drug trafficking, whenever we try to close, the U.S. tries to close the access through Central America and through Mexico, the shipment goes through the Caribbean, then when we shut down the Caribbean, they go back to Central America. Right now, we're in the phase of everything's going through the Caribbean, while a large segment is going through the Caribbean. Are there conversations on the issue of increasing of patrols, be that Navy, Coast Guard, like in previous efforts when we're trying to curtail drug trafficking in the region, particularly through Puerto Rico, but overall in the Caribbean? Are there conversations of increased cooperation between Coast Guard, Navy, and the different countries in the region? Thank you.
That will be one of the topics that we will take up in this CODEL trip, the military cooperation between those countries and the United States, particularly as it pertains to drug trafficking and human trafficking. And so we're very cognizant that this is a growing problem, one that impacts not only the United States, but those countries as well, as we see a surge in crime, in violence, and in drug trade itself in those countries that perhaps in the past were just used as a stop point on the drug trade, are now witnessing, those countries are witnesses very serious internal issues with drugs. So we're looking forward to discussing that as we fly over to some of those countries during the weekend. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Congressman.
Thank you so much. I just also would like to end by recognizing the presence of a great New Yorker, because he grew up in New York and went to high school in New York, former President Leonel Fernandez.
Thank you very much, Mr. Congressman, for honoring us with your presence. Our next speaker is from the executive, the senior-most person at the State Department responsible for Caribbean affairs. Ambassador Merten has served these last 6 months as the acting principal deputy assistant secretary for Haiti, Canada, Caribbean affairs, and the Office of Policy, Planning, and Coordination. The ambassador has served as ambassador in Croatia and in Haiti. While he was in Haiti, he oversaw the U.S. government's on-the-ground efforts to provide immediate relief after the devastating 2010 earthquake. In the days after the earthquake, he oversaw the largest evacuation of American citizens from a country since World War II. That sounded impressive. Ambassador Merten, together with his Office of Caribbean Affairs, Brad Fredden and Jamie O'Melia, were responsible for putting together this recently released strategy document on U.S. Caribbean relations. Ken, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much for the kind introduction. It's great to be here today. First of all, I also want to acknowledge President Fernandez. Thank you so much for honoring us with your presence here today. It's great to be here with you. I also want to thank Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, for hosting this event. We believe that this is an important moment in our engagement. When I say our, I mean our broader engagement, the United States engagement with the Caribbean, and we're delighted that they are spending some time helping us focus on this important region. While our geographic proximity makes us neighbors, our relationship with the Caribbean is really about much more than points on a map or locations on a map. The U.S. and the Caribbean share many common interests and deep societal ties that yield daily and tangible benefits for U.S. and Caribbean citizens alike. We hope that this new strategy will enrich what has been a historically very dynamic relationship and will deepen U.S. Caribbean engagement on a range of issues that are of interest to both Caribbean societies and the United States. The enactment of H.R. 4939 and the new strategy that was produced as a result would not have been possible without the support and involvement of the Caribbean American diaspora community. We met with them several times as we were working on this, as we did also with several of the embassies here from representing the region. At approximately 4 million residents in the United States, the Caribbean diaspora community is large, resilient, and an invaluable source of insight as we reorganize and re-energize our policies towards the region. Today, Caribbean Americans include members of Congress, as you just witnessed, Representative Espaillat, and former Secretary of State, a former Attorney General, legislators, academics, and nationally acclaimed artists, musicians, and journalists. These interconnections between people of the United States and the Caribbean are just a few examples of the deep ties that bind our relationship. It's a privilege to recognize the historic opportunities that lay before us as a result of the U.S. Caribbean Strategic Engagement Act of 2016. This was bipartisan legislation co-sponsored by U.S. Congressman Eliot Engel and Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, who is also a Caribbean American, by the way, and it expresses a commitment to increase U.S. engagement with Caribbean countries, the diaspora community within the United States, the private sector, and civil society. The legislation also tasks the Department of State with creating a strategy to implement this vision. We consulted a variety of stakeholders across and outside government to arrive at a relevant, effective, and culturally competent plan. Last week, I had the honor of testifying before the House Foreign Affairs Committee on the strategy, and I think I can confidently say that this is a monumental step towards the engagement our nations aspire to achieve for the benefit of our citizens and economies. CSIS, of course, was one of the department's key stakeholders in the collaborative process of defining that multi-year strategy. The center held 3 roundtable meetings to exchange ideas on security, economics, and energy concerns in the Caribbean. The report launched today represents key takeaways from those meetings. I applaud Michael Matera and all of his contributing authors for producing this comprehensive report, one that sheds light on core issues, the dynamic nature of Caribbean relations, and the potential developments looking forward. We recognize that many of the Caribbean's most urgent needs are shared challenges. As a result, the multi-year strategy to advance the well-being of the people of the United States and the Caribbean includes 6 main pillars: security, prosperity, diplomacy, energy, education, and health. I'm pleased to report we have already begun to make progress on these pillars. On security, through the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, which the Congressman mentioned, the U.S. has provided $451 million since 2010. Our cooperation focuses on professionalizing police forces, confronting violent organized crime, dismantling illicit trafficking networks, and implementing community-based crime prevention programs. Through CBSI, we supported training and facility upgrades at the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service Training Academy to develop it into a regional training hub, which has now trained officers from 8 other CBSI partner nations. On prosperity, we will continue to promote sustainable growth, open markets for U.S. exports, and private sector-led investment. Last year, our embassy in Georgetown, Guyana, led a business delegation to the Solar Power Invitational Forum in Las Vegas, leading to a Guyanese company purchasing $528,000 in solar technology from a U.S. firm, which it used to run its facilities entirely on renewable energy. In the area of diplomacy, we are raising the political level of our engagement with the Caribbean. Earlier this month, our Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Ambassador Tom Shannon, traveled to Grenada to meet Caribbean leaders and foreign ministers on the margin of CARICOM's annual heads of government meetings. Myself and my colleague, Acting Assistant Secretary Palmieri, have also made several recent trips to the region. Tom Shannon's trip was the first time a high-ranking U.S. official attended the Heads of Government meeting, a clear testament to our support to the strategy and renewed partnerships with the Caribbean. On energy, we're making strides towards increasing the energy and economic security of Caribbean island nations by reducing reliance on imported petroleum products. Through the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative, we are using U.S. financing resources and technical expertise to maximize the menu of energy technology options the region can affordably access, including renewable energy and, importantly, natural gas. On education, we're facilitating exchanges for students, scholars, teachers, and professionals to promote economic development and entrepreneurship. In the Bahamas, for example, 22-year-old Travis Robinson was recently elected to serve as a member of Parliament after returning from the State Department's prestigious International Visitor Leadership Program. In the area of health, we will continue to partner with countries in the region in the fight against infectious diseases. Our efforts to respond to emergencies, such as the Haiti earthquake of 2010, are examples of our commitment to support the health, emergencies, and well-being and address long-term health and security challenges in the region. Through the strategy we've developed, we're reaching out a stronger hand to our friends in the Caribbean in the form of new and more vibrant opportunities for collaboration and cooperation. To that end, preparations are underway for our annual Caribbean Security Initiative high-level dialogue to be hosted in the Dominican Republic this autumn. In addition, we've already begun planning a Caribbean Trade and Investment Conference to take place in Miami this coming November, one of our key commitments under the strategy's prosperity pillar. These initiatives are consistent with our commitment to advance engagement with our partners in the Caribbean to build a more safe and prosperous Western Hemisphere. Once again, thank you to CSIS for hosting this event and for producing such a thoughtful and insightful report. Our policy in the Caribbean is made stronger by such collaboration with partners such as CSIS. By helping us to better understand the depth and breadth of our commonalities and interconnectedness, we can together make informed decisions towards greater mutual prosperity. I want to thank you all for your attention and for such a good turnout today in support of the Caribbean. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ken. I understand you have maybe 5 minutes to take questions. You're headed up to the hill yourself.
I have to head up to the hill myself, yes.
Do we have questions in the gentleman in the back?
Hi, Andrew Miller with the Oak Ridge Institute of Science Education. I'm a science fellow. I had a question about, the congressman had talked about Puerto Rico and the USVI, and I wanted to ask if there's any way of engaging the Caribbean through the territories or any thought of that with the strategy. Thank you.
That's a great question. Unfortunately, one that I'm not in a great position to answer. We, in the areas that I deal with, we deal with the non-U.S. countries. Having said that, I think we have tremendous resources to draw on through the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. Obviously, with the kind of interconnectedness the Congressman was talking about, I think we should and are making use of those folks. We certainly hope that through events like the Trade and Investment Conference we're doing in November, we have robust participation from particularly from private sector entities that are represented in U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. But at the end of the day, our focus at the State Department is directly to the foreign governments.
Other questions? We have two back here, if we can take them together.
Yes, sir. Eric Thompson. I'm with Diplomatic Security. And I recently returned from Haiti. And my question is, what exactly is going to be done in regards to corruption and security there, or in the Caribbean? Because that's two major issues that I see going hand in hand.
Sure, that's a great question. I think we all recognize that corruption is a problem in every country, and it is not unique to one country or one region. It's a global problem. It's a global phenomenon that we all work to fight against. I think the United States has a very strong record, particularly in this hemisphere, in working with our partners and local governments in combating corruption. It's not to say the work is done. That's not to say it's not ongoing. But I think our belief is that, number one, increased prosperity in the region will reduce the temptations for corruption. Number two, increased emphasis on rule of law, building up law enforcement programs, building up judicial programs in countries, again, such as Haiti, but a lot of other places in the region, will be helpful for helping countries form a legal framework where actually making it illegal for government officials to take bribes. In the case of Haiti, for example, through some of the work the United States did, we helped them draft a law that actually made it illegal and clear to codify what exactly corruption was and what was punishable. And we're happy to report that Haiti has had its first prosecution of a government official in the last 18 months under that statute. So we continue to be engaged on this. We continue to make progress. Again, not to imply that the work is done, but it's a challenge, and we continue to confront it.
Thank you for your presentation, Angus Friday, Grenada's ambassador to the United States. Very interested in your comments and your presentation on the energy nexus, and we certainly heard that from the previous speaker as well, the importance of energy to the Caribbean. And we're delighted to see that the energy program has been able to move from one administration to the next. I was wondering, however, do you have any views on how we could inject more emphasis, more momentum into the program, particularly in terms of the dealing with the regulatory frameworks that we need to deal with to overcome a lot of the monopolies we have in the region, which contributes to the high cost, but also in terms of the financing, to ensure that we can move, in terms of megawatts, to much more renewable sources and other sources of energy. So how can we measure success in terms of megawatts with both legal support and, of course, financial support? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one I think we could probably spend the entire morning and afternoon talking about. I'll try to keep my answer relatively brief. In our analysis, the reason we talk about energy prices is energy in our strategy is that most countries in the Caribbean suffer from very high energy costs. And this is a hindrance to economic development. This is a hindrance for them to develop their export capacity. This also leaves them, in many cases, dependent on certain providers of petroleum products, which are not necessarily always have these other countries' best interests at heart. I think that our goal is to work with countries, as we've done in some cases, to help them recraft their legal structure so that monopolies are broken up, so that other forms of electricity, either generation or importation, can be allowed. I think, as those of you who were at the hearing last week on Capitol Hill will have heard, there is a good deal of interest by many members of Congress in exploring what can be done with U.S. natural gas. Can we step that up a little bit more? LNG going to some parts of the region. I believe, if I remember from one of the meetings I had in Jamaica, Jamaica is a good example of a country that has changed its legal framework and now has the capacity to import import this. I believe also in the Dominican Republic, they're moving in that direction. So I think there are some good models in the region. I think, again, there's still some work to do. This is what we will be engaging with through our diplomacy, through our embassies on the ground, through USAID in some cases. It is not something that's going to change from one day to the next. It's going to take some long, patient work. And I think it's important to recognize that in many countries, there are some very important vested interests that are involved in keeping the energy prices high. And I think we need to work with all stakeholders to make sure that governments understand that those special interests are not the only ones who need to have their voices heard.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Russell King. I just have a general question about the Haiti earthquake. Can you explain geologically what happened, and was there any kind of forewarning of it, and what sort of lessons can you give us concerning the earthquake?
Sure. Again, a subject I could probably talk all afternoon about, but hopefully won't. Haiti and the Dominican Republic actually share two fault lines, one which runs east to west across the southern part of Hispaniola, and one which runs east and west across the northern part of the country of the island, I should say, excuse me. Geologists have long thought that the fracture up in the northern part of the island is the one that was due to produce a strong seismic event. That didn't happen, hasn't happened yet. Let's hope it doesn't happen in any of our lifetimes or any time, frankly. The fault in the southern part of the island had been basically quiet without a major seismic event for over 200 years. However, geologists know that these places on the fault lines are vulnerable. And if you look back at history, I want to say it's 1740, but don't quote me on the date. Port-au-Prince was at that time destroyed by an earthquake, and it had passed out of living memory, and people had simply forgotten that Port-au-Prince was in a seismically sensitive zone. And fortunately, I'll give a plug to our colleagues at the Official Buildings Office, the State Department, that when they built the new embassy that we were in at the time of the earthquake, they had done their homework and had realized that Port-au-Prince was on a seismically potentially active zone and built the embassy accordingly. As a result, we were able to use the embassy to mobilize the rescue effort to get over 16,000 people evacuated to make sure that Haitians got food, water, and shelter in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, which killed well over 200,000 people. So beyond that, I probably now exhausted my full geologic knowledge on the subject, but there we are. Anyway, thanks for the question.
Great. Ambassador Merten, thank you very much. I didn't know we had a qualified geologist at the State Department, but I'm impressed. I'm impressed.
Good.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much for joining us. Great. I'd now like to invite George Farriol and David Lewis and the three authors to join us here on the podium. George is the person who, more than any one person, has inspired this Caribbean program. I had coffee with George a few weeks before I started here at CSIS, and George at that point talked of wanting to get this initiative underway, and the fact that it has is testament to his commitment. Okay.
The two opening talks really gives us a sense that this is a meeting of the Caribbean. I will not hide the fact that I am delighted to be sitting up here to talk about the report that CSIS is just issuing on the Caribbean. There are a number of issues which already have been raised, both just now by Ambassador Merten as well as by Congressman Espaillat, a number of themes that anyone following either U.S. policy with the Caribbean or the Caribbean in general, this all sounds very familiar. Clearly, this also gives us an opportunity to pull all these various pieces together in a more coherent whole. This is also something of a reunion. I've worked on and off with these distinguished gentlemen here over the years, and pleased to bring them all together into another effort. We're also delighted. This is just amazing in a way. We have the former president of the Dominican Republic with us. We have Minister Ducaran, who's here also with us. And to me, it's really an indication that with a little effort, people who are actually focusing on the region all come together and contribute positively. Let me give you a little background about how we got to this point, and then turn this over really to the people who, the three authors, principal authors of this report. As Michael indicated, a number of us got together last year and focused specifically on how to build a Caribbean initiative. And it in effect started with sort of 5 basic ideas. Some of them, probably all of them, are not going to be terribly, you're going to find them rather common in a way, but I think relevant to repeat here. The first is that regardless of what broader strategic interest may suggest when people write about or talk about U.S. policy in general, foreign policy, the U.S. Caribbean agenda does bring together a critical mix of issues. Just as we just heard from the 2 talks, energy policy is one of those issues. There are political, diplomatic, and security interests that ultimately have an effect and do shape U.S. interests. And what happens in the Caribbean ultimately ties together very closely to U.S. interests. So this is not something to be forgotten. Second, although there's really, we don't want to turn this into a sort of an analysis of where we've come from, but I think we also reflect on the fact that a lot of the existing policy frameworks, the institutional arrangement that exists either vis-a-vis the Caribbean in the U.S. policy context or in the Caribbean itself is rich. The Caribbean Basin Security Initiative has already been mentioned several times. The CBI, CARICOM, all these other various regional arrangements all have implied ambitious mandates and significant multilateral initiatives, but one can also argue that when you piece them all together, you're not quite sure exactly what the whole ultimately is really trying to achieve. It really suggests that there's a need to deepen thinking about how all these pieces come together and how they can be sustained. Third, I think there was also in our thinking an evolving concern over the last 3 decades of an increasing compartmentalization of U.S. policy towards the Caribbean. And Ambassador Merten knows that better than many because he represents one of those carve-outs that exist, if you will, about how the United States deals with the Caribbean. There are Haitian affairs, there's Cuban affairs, and how all these pieces come together in the context of a definition of U.S. policy with the Caribbean is not always very easy to achieve. Fourth, we also, as we started looking at these issues, we sort of came to the tentative conclusion that there may be maybe new ways of thinking about Caribbean policy. And in an interesting way, Congressman Espaillat sort of alluded to one of those constructs, which we have sort of informally come to talk about sort of sub-regional functionalism. In his talk, he emphasized a set of countries which are basically in the Northern Caribbean. He emphasized Puerto Rico, he emphasized the Dominican Republic, he mentioned Cuba, he also mentioned Haiti. You can also extend that a little bit probably in terms of trade and investment interest to Jamaica. In effect, sort of a northern tier, if you will, sub-regional functionalism. You could think of an opposite element or interpretation, which if you look at the Southern Caribbean, where there are common security, extractive industry, energy-related issues, particularly emerging with Suriname and Guyana, Trinidad's historical platform as an oil and gas powerhouse in many ways. If you stretch that a little further to the west to include the Curacao, Aruba, there, let alone Venezuela to some degree on the mainland, you have, if you will, a number of common issues which tie that portion of the Caribbean together. So this sort of notion that one way maybe to look at policy in the region might be to look at some of the sub-regional or functional interests that ultimately tie these countries together. And a fifth issue, which sort of obviously caught our attention, and again, Congressman Espaillat is a good example, and in a way, President Fernandez is also an interesting example of that, which is the role of the diaspora, the interaction, the human interaction between the Caribbean and the United States. It's a remarkable resource. It has a capability of shaping policy towards the region, and also it, to some degree, provides an opportunity for the countries themselves, if you will, to interact in a different and unique way with the U.S. policy-making communities. So that's sort of the backdrop to our thinking, and as we were going through these thoughts, we were absolutely delighted by the fact that H.R. 4939 was working its way through Congress last year and ultimately was passed. And this ultimately provided us with an even greater opportunity, if you will, to pull together some more concrete ideas and, as Ambassador Merten alluded to a moment ago, to try to help in any way that we could in deep thought, if you will, about how to make H.R. 4939 a reality and how to operationalize it. And as noted, we held 3 roundtables earlier this spring, and as a backdrop to those roundtables, we commissioned, in effect, 3 individuals who really know the subject matter very well to not only talk about it, but actually write about it, and this is ultimately the heart of the report that we're issuing today. The 3 areas which we picked had to be sort of regional in scope, strategic and security perspective, the region's economic policy context, and also an assessment of the Caribbean's expanding and potentially very significant role in the area of energy policy, particularly in the Southern Caribbean. This report, in fact, for us is a baseline assessment, and as we sort of move forward to the next months and years, will also provide us with an opportunity to go back and look at some of the benchmarks that are going to come out of the 4939 process, and we'll be able to analyze ultimately how this all moves forward, both to the benefit of the United States, but also to the benefit of the region itself. So let me now turn to the 3 authors of the report. David Lewis, who is my co-conspirator in a lot of these activities, both of us will moderate the discussion, but first we want to give about 5 minutes to each of the 3 authors to give us a quick overview of some of the highlights of their report. We're going to start in the way they appear in the report. Evan Ellis will go first, and then Scott MacDonald to my right, and then Tony Anthony Bryan from the University of the West Indies. All of them have I believe so, Michael, right? A senior associate status with CSIS, so it's all a big happy family. I will not bother you with the resumes. We have a short version of it in the report. Their real resumes goes on for pages and pages. I can just say they're wonderful. Evan, it's yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the assembled audience with such distinguished people as President Fernandez. It's a real honor for me to be able to share my work with this distinguished group and with yourself, sir. First of all, in addition to my status as senior fellow here at CSIS, my day job is as the Latin America and Caribbean research professor at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. And so I feel it necessary to at least note that everything I'm going to say here today and what's in the report is purely my own opinion and does not in any way represent the U.S. government or any other institution beyond that. Having said that, my focus is to take a look at the Caribbean in strategic terms. Not only the Caribbean with respect to the island of the Greater Antilles, Lesser Antilles, etc., but also the Caribbean in its relationship with the surrounding states of the Caribbean Basin and the surrounding global community, including not only the United States, but extra-regional actors from China, Russia, India, and a number of others. Let me make just a few key points about those and then talk a little bit about some of the sources of concern for me moving forward in the Caribbean. So point number one is it's useful to recognize that in many ways, because of the U.S. proximity to the Caribbean, that the U.S. is both the source of many of the Caribbean security challenge as well as the resources for many of the solutions, in the sense that tourists, migrants, and others, the flow of drugs through the Caribbean, the flow of contraband goods through the Caribbean, in many ways are driven by or in part the U.S. market. But reciprocally, the U.S. does supply the market for tourism, the important trade relationship, and indeed many of the important programs, including what I'm very happy to understand appears to be on track for the renewal of its current level of funding, the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. Beyond that, also, it's important to recognize that the Caribbean, because of its fragmented nature, despite the many attempts over the years for regional unification, CARICOM, Organization of East Caribbean States, et cetera, but the nature of individual small states make it vulnerable not only to the corruption of transnational criminal organizations, but also to the agendas of a variety of different foreign governments, from Venezuela to the PRC and Russia to obviously the United States. Beyond that, I find it useful to think of the security environment in the Caribbean shaped by the intersection of flows and external actors, because so much of what is of concern in the Caribbean from a security standpoint, again, people, money, licit and illicit goods flowing through the region, etc., with the exception of weather, which is Congressman mentioned, is a key driver with a expected worse than normal hurricane season coming this year. But so many of the other things have to do with those flows and the way in which external actors interface with that. In the interest of time, let me just hit on the activity of one of the principal extra-regional actors, and that is the People's Republic of China. It's not widely recognized the degree to which China has not only engaged itself in the region in political terms and military terms as well as economic terms, but the way in which, at least on a per capita basis, China has done things in the Caribbean that it actually has not done anyplace else in Latin America to an extent. So if you recall, actually when China's current president, Xi Jinping, first began to engage the Americas, what was one of the first stops but Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, I'm sorry. Thank you. But beyond that, with respect to economics, of course, you have the Chinese have invested their own money beyond just the types of loans that they have given to Venezuela, Ecuador, and other places in ways that you don't see elsewhere. We can talk about the recently almost completed $4.2 billion Baja Mar resort in Nassau. We can talk about the approximately $3 billion which has gone into the greater logistics complex around the Hutchison-Whampoa operated commercial hub in Freeport. We can talk about important investments in Jamaica, such as the North-South Highway and the new project for the East-West Highway, et cetera, et cetera. But with respect to the military, we can also talk about things that you do not find to a degree in other places. The very first place in which the People's Liberation Army in recent times contributed troops for the long term was the 8 years that they spent in support of the MINUSTAH peacekeeping force in Haiti. The first 2 times that China's new hospital ship, the PSARC, was sent to the region, both cases focused on trips to the Caribbean and multiple stops there. When the U.S. was negotiating the resumption of diplomatic ties with Cuba, the Chinese actually sent the PLA Navy 20th Task Force several ships to park in Havana Harbor at the time. With respect to military sales, of course, while the sales are relatively small, at the same time, the security forces in the region are small. We can talk about the $6 million in funds and the Y-12 Chinese aircraft operated by the Guyanese Defense Force, similar amounts of aid to the Jamaica Defense Force, the donation of long-range patrol vessels to Trinidad and Tobago, the donation of other boats to Guyana and Suriname and others, and recently the donation of armored vehicles and riot control gear to the Bahamas. In addition, it's useful to mention that other actors of interest, such as Russia, have made the focus of their re-engagement in the region, specifically the Caribbean. So if you think about Russian engagement, it's three principal partners: Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And the activities that Russia has conducted, especially since 2008 to get our attention, specifically the flying of backfire bombers in the region and the sending of naval task forces, have all taken place in the Caribbean context. Finally, let me conclude by noting there are a number of different sources of instability, or at least change, that I think make the region of importance. Number one, of course, what happens with the transition in Cuba this coming February when Cuba selects its leader as Rafael Castro steps down. And to what degree will Cuba be tempted to embrace more fully Russia and China if it gives up on engagement with the United States? Number two, of course, Haiti. As the current MINUSTAH peacekeeping force fully withdraws and passes over to a new police force in November, at the same time that the U.S. will be thinking about whether or not to renew temporary protective status for Haitian migrants and a number of other important decisions. Of course, Guyana, as Guyana tries to deal with the real blessing of about 2 to 2.5 billion barrels of recoverable oil, which it will be bringing online in the next couple of years, and that will transform the Guyanese Shield in the region. Oftentimes we neglect the impact of other actors, such as Colombia. The massive expansion of cocoa production in Colombia, a lot of that not only goes through Central America, as the congressman pointed out, but through places like the Dominican Republic and Haiti, not only to the United States, but also Europe, but as well, increasingly also with European destinations through the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. And of course, Venezuela, which not only has impacted the drug flows, but the migrant flows, especially in the Dominican Republic, because of the special Hispanic connection, but also many other places like Trinidad and Tobago, including also impacts in terms of arms and crime, not just drug. And finally, as we look at the situation in Panama right now, the way in which the diplomatic truce, which long prevailed between the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China on recognition, as Panama had just changed its diplomatic recognition, there are some concerns that the diplomatic war could be back on again. And if that is the case, the type of struggle that we saw in the Caribbean prior to 2008 could be resumed, and that will have some very significant impacts. So a lot of potential sources that make the Caribbean worth keeping an eye on, especially since the Caribbean, in terms of people and in terms of economic flows and other things, is so very close and so very dear to the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. We're going to hold off on questions and just go through the opening presentations. Scott?
Thank you, George. First of all, I do thank Michael and David and George for putting this program together. It's greatly appreciated and certainly badly needed for people that have an interest in the Caribbean. President Fernandez, it's a pleasure to have you here today as well. In terms of the Caribbean and the economic issues, I believe the Caribbean's at an inflection point. We've reached a stage where there's an awful lot of variables that have been put on the table, some of which are very different from what we've experienced in the past. We have Venezuela, which is teetering on the brink of collapse or civil war or something that we don't know. You have the issue of what is the future of Cuba. We've had changes of U.S. policy vis-a-vis Cuba here, but it raises an issue as to what's going to happen with Cuba. We have a NAFTA renegotiation. What's the fallout for the Caribbean in terms of what comes out of NAFTA? There's Brexit. Whoever thought that the UK would be leaving the European Union, but that has implications as well for Caribbean goods going to the European Union and certainly going to the UK. There are competitive challenges, educational needs that come with e-commerce. How do we make the Caribbean competitive going forward? There's the debt issue. You've heard this mentioned with Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And Puerto Rico is the sort of position now that last year in 2016, they defaulted on $72 billion of debt. That's eye-catching. That's a big deal. U.S. Virgin Islands finances, if you look at it, they're very stretched, and they're undergoing a process which is definitely going to be very painful in rectifying the situation. But it's not just the U.S. Virgin Islands or Puerto Rico. Jamaica's had years and years of restructuring their economy. They've done a lot of very positive things in Jamaica, but the debt is still above 100% of GDP. And you have, in all these cases, what I call debt fatigue. Anybody that went through the Latin American debt crisis in the 1980s, debt fatigue was a huge item which wore governments down. And you look at what's going on in Greece over the last 5 or 6 years, populations get tired, politics becomes dysfunctional, it erodes legitimacy in governments. And debt fatigue is an issue in a lot of places in the Caribbean. Evan mentioned China. China is putting a lot of money into the Caribbean. They put people in, they develop it. If you want a cricket stadium or hospital, this is actually what they will come in and they do produce it. That, like Evan said, they put their own money into it. They bring a working group and they are developing certain strategic alignments, especially for trade. Who's China's largest trade partner? It's the United States. A lot of that trade goes to the Panama Canal, but it goes through the Caribbean to Gulf ports and ports along the eastern seaboard. So China is thinking long-term and strategically, and if you're sitting on the other side of the table and the U.S. has been a little bit, has not been as forthcoming and less engaged in the Caribbean, here comes somebody that wants to be engaged in your region and is bringing a checkbook. So China has a role to play, and that's a big variable economically. Oil, energy. You have the haves and the have-nots. Guyana hit the jackpot. The question is, how do you manage oil wealth? On the flip side of that, you have a lot of energy vulnerability for a number of other countries. What do you do in terms of alternatives? We mentioned LNG. That is going to be a big item going forward. Infrastructure, I think in 2014, the Caribbean Development Bank said that infrastructure needs, and this is energy, but it also includes ports and roads, there's needs of about $30 billion over the next 10 years, so 2024, I believe. Probably, this is for the sake of time, probably to me, the most important issue facing the Caribbean's economic development and its economic relations with the United States is de-risking. And de-risking is not hiding the car keys from your teenage son or daughter on a Friday night. De-risking is the act in which banks, mainly in advanced economies, the United States, Canada, Europe, they pull back on their correspondent relationships. Any country or any region which is quote-unquote suspicious, has problems with money laundering, banks do not want to be involved. It is a question of not being caught with money laundering, financing of terrorism, tax evasion. So the easy thing for banks has been to cut correspondent banking relationships. Why is this important for the Caribbean? Well, according to the Caribbean Association of Banks 2016, 12 countries have lost a substantial amount of the correspondent banking. Credit is the life flow of a capitalistic system. You need money to make things work. In some ways, I try to think of credit in the fashion of a car engine. Car engines need lubricant, they need oil, and if you don't have lubricant or oil in the car engine, what happens? It comes to a halt. And this is the same thing with credit in the Caribbean, that if you continue to tighten the correspondent banking relationships and diminish it through de-risking, there's going to be problems. There already are problems for some countries. I think one country in the Caribbean had no correspondent relations at one stage. I might have gotten that wrong, but I think it was one of the countries that was down there. So the question is, there are big issues. For the United States, the Caribbean is important. Just in terms of trade, the Caribbean is a great area for U.S. businesses. The trade surplus last year was around $6 billion. It was smaller than the year before, but it will probably be in the positive side this year. But the amount of money that trade in the region is actually falling from the U.S. perspective. And that is something that needs to be looked at as well, and it's part of the discussion on revitalization. But one last point I'll make, and since we're time constrained up here, if you do not have economic growth, you do not have legitimate economic growth, you do not allow the people the means to be part of a bigger international economic system and a financial system, then you begin to erode the foundations of mutual relations and trust, which create a good economic relationship between regions and countries. George.
Thank you, Scott, for some really crisp thoughts on the economic area of Caribbean policy. Tony?
Thank you very much, George. And thank you, Mike Matera, for having invited me, and to my co-conspirators here at the table, some of whom I haven't seen for a while. And also recognizing two long-standing friends, former President Leonel Fernandez and Minister Winston Ducaran, former finance minister and governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. I mentioned them, they deserve the recognition, but also, gentlemen, the three of us are aging wonderfully. You know, George, I'm very glad that you didn't go into any sort of biographical introduction and left it up to the people to read it, because the last time I was introduced at an energy conference, one of the particular person, the chair, wanted to announce my affiliation as a member of the Association of Caribbean Economic Specialists. He misinterpreted it and said, Professor Bryan, a member of the Association of Caribbean Economic Socialists. At the time, I looked around frantically to see if Hugo Chavez was in attendance, and he wasn't. So, you know, some mistakes can be made. But that's all behind us now. That's one of the key things about energy in the Caribbean, actually. The fact that Petrocaribe is a dead horse. No longer is there the possibility of support from Venezuela. Venezuela itself is in serious condition. So it, as President Fernandez would say, it has forced us to rethink the whole energy picture and the geopolitics of energy in the region. The paper that you will have in your report on energy is rather extensive, as are the other papers. So there's no point going into it in detail. What I would like to do is just simply highlight, I think, a few trends that you might want to bear in mind. If you have any other questions afterwards, we can always debate them. I think there's time for that. Now, the key points, I think, is that, first of all, there is a persistence in terms of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels have not disappeared, nor will they for several decades to come. But the global fall in oil prices has produced very mixed results for the Caribbean. Oil-importing countries have benefited from lower commodity prices, obviously, while oil and natural gas exporters, such as Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago, face declining revenues from the sector with serious political consequences in each case. So this is something that we might, it's not a flat, it's not a level playing field. It is much more involved than that. A major trend, I think, is the emergence of new offshore oil provinces in the wider Caribbean. Guyana, Suriname, Cuba, French Guyana, and the renewed investment in the deep water by international companies, IOCs, in the mature and oil and gas province of Trinidad and Tobago. That has been one of the very surprising things in the past few months, actually, that it seems every day you open the newspapers in Trinidad, they've hit another oil and gas field. The country certainly has a shortfall, as Minister Ducaran knows very well, in terms of its finances. Actually, it's unable even to supply enough LNG now to even domestic industries, because we have a fantastic industrial complex of steel, oil, methanol, things like that. And everyone is just hoping, maybe by 2018, 2019, that this situation will reverse itself and that we'll be back in the money. Well, we got to do some planning before that. But that's important. Cuba has proven to be a deep water, not exciting place at all. As a matter of fact, American investment is, if the administration allows it, is there. But the point is, so far it's proven to be dry. The real excitement, my dear friends, is in the Guyana-Suriname basin. That is where, even up to last week, the new Payara well was struck again. And the Guyanese are faced with a very, very serious kind of dilemma. How do you manage this thing without creating terrible economic or political dysfunction? We all know about the resource curse. We all know what can happen if you do not manage it carefully. And I'm pleased to say that the administration in Guyana is very, very open to getting help from other sources. The United States is critical in this respect. And so far, as we know, Trinidad and Tobago has become a very important logistics base for everything that the Guyanese want to do with respect to oil and oil supply. Also, the refineries in the area, the best refineries actually Statsoli in Suriname and Petrotrin in Trinidad and Tobago. There are others, of course, but those are the two closest. And so the Guyanese find that it's not necessary to build a refinery anyhow, because there is excess capacity elsewhere. I think a second trend in the region is the growing importance of natural gas, LNG, and CNG as transition fuels. The United States and Trinidad and Tobago are the major producers and exporters of LNG. The Dominican Republic is emerging as a key transshipment point for the wider region, as is at least Jamaica has talked about doing it and has teamed up with Fortress Energy in the United States in order to do it. So this distribution of LNG and CNG, not necessarily by the big vessels, obviously, but some of it, you take a country like Barbados, for example, you can ship it just in regular cylinders on a barge. It doesn't take that much to fire up the electricity supplies in Barbados, to say nothing of a small country like St. Kitts, Nevis, or anything like that. Those are the kinds of things that we see happening. Now, the third, I think, is the shift to various forms of renewable energy, Ari. I'm talking here specifically of geothermal, solar, hydro, and wind for power generation in the Caribbean. You have some difficulties there. The small size of the local markets, the technical hurdles, the challenge of capital investment. But despite that, ambitious goals have been set by several island countries, including Cuba, Jamaica, Barbados, Dominica, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. As a matter of fact, it is reasonable to expect that the country of St. Kitts Nevis is going to be almost entirely dependent on renewable energy in the very near future. And finally, I think a very big trend, in my opinion, is discernible progress towards regional energy cooperation and integration. This is something we've talked about for many years. I remember George, CSIS, having done a very important study when Sidney Weintraub was here on the idea of energy cooperation in the Western Hemisphere. We weren't very optimistic at the time I was a contributor to one of the chapters there. But what we've seen is energy cooperation and integration coming about because of several factors. First of all, U.S. natural gas trade and energy diplomacy towards the region. The two government officials talked about that earlier this morning. You have emerging cross-border oil and gas exploration. You have development of natural gas pipeline infrastructure networks. This is coming about actually in a big way between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela. Nothing more than 7 miles separates those two countries. They have cross-border unitization, projects going ahead. So for the first time, it's reasonable to assume that the energy, the energy resources of both Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela will be certainly exploited to the common good. You also have the functioning, as I said before, of Trinidad as a deep-water logistics base for energy service companies. They're building oil and gas capacity of Guyana, Suriname, French Guyana, and islands in the Southern Caribbean. So all of this is very good news as far as I'm concerned. I think the U.S., as I say, has a very serious role to play. It's been outlined, in fact, in the paper, and it can be the subject of discussion here. But what you're doing is really strengthening cooperation in the hemisphere in many areas, trade, security, economic development, and also energy. Let me just conclude with a little word of warning about something. For every good outcome, there could be a bad one. And one of the outcomes that I see is the development of RE, renewable energy. That's the future. In fact, solar energy is what is being touted as the best possible way. And, the prices are dropping. The pension funds in the Caribbean and the banks are all interested in going into RE and investing in it. It is a slow development, but there's a downside because it can, I think, pose a significant threat in that extensive fuel resources, as we have in the region, may eventually become unburnable and redundant, okay? So you have this issue of stranded assets, in other words. When you talk about stranded assets in financial terms, you usually talk about assets that have suffered from unanticipated or premature write-downs, devaluations, or conversion to liabilities. But of course, this is a possibility. Climate risk challenge is looming larger as a real economic challenge for hydrocarbon economies. So we might, at some point, see that all of these resources, whether it's Guyana, Suriname, or whatever, and the GSP, that as I say, they become unburnable and they become static. Now, that is just my sort of take on the idea. Hopefully, I'll be proven wrong. I'll not be around to really remember it. So let me just conclude then by saying that there's optimism. Let me remind all of us that the paths to energy sufficiency are varied. There's no level playing field for it. We are moving at different speeds, and the U.S. can expect to play a very big role in whatever is to be the outcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. You just have heard 3 wonderful snapshots of what this report is all about. I'll be a bit old-fashioned here, and I encourage you to actually read the report. There's value in it, a lot of substantive ideas. Now, clearly, we can't cover all aspects of Caribbean policy, not only in one report, but also in a 45-minute panel discussion. But at least you get a sense of what some of the issues are. And it's not always the challenges, and also opportunities are part of the package. Before we open it up for questions and discussion, let me sort of go back to all 3 panelists and ask them sort of a comment on a very general question as a sort of a backdrop to moving forward. What are we looking at? And the question is, I'd be interested in your thoughts, which is, if you look at, let's say, the next 12 months, think a little bit of within the context of the 3 themes that you've identified, that you've talked about, that you follow very closely. if you look at the calendar of the next 12 months, what are the main highlights that one should remember when you look at U.S. Caribbean relations or Caribbean policy issues in general? For example, there was a reference earlier by I think it was Ambassador, it might have been, I don't know whether it was Ambassador Merten or Congressman Espaillat, about the transition in Cuba in 2018, as announced by Raul. That kind of event, both in the security area, in the economic area, and the energy policy area. Evan?
Well, thank you very much. Well, of course, also in addition to what Ambassador Merten had mentioned with respect to the upcoming Caribbean Ministerial Forum, which I believe is in October. On the Caribbean side, of course, two big events, and I mentioned them briefly in my previous remarks. Of course, number one is the replacement of MINUSTA in Haiti with a new police force in November, and so lots of things will be happening in anticipation as we reach that date. And of course, on the U.S. side, the expiration of TPS, or at least that discussion here in Washington over whether we do that. And then, of course, with respect to Cuba, again, the February 2018 changeover. Really, on the electoral calendar, some of the big events of 2017 have already passed. Of course, you had important elections recently with the changeover in power in the Bahamas with a new Hubert Minnis government. Bermuda just changed over in a new government, a somewhat more inclusive, somewhat more ambiguous result in the Cayman Islands. But you do have minor elections coming up in Aruba and Grenada, but Cuba continues to be the big one.
Scott?
Yeah, I would say for the Caribbean, the big economic issues that kind of sit on the horizon. One is what's going to happen here in the U.S. economy, in particular the Federal Reserve. And the Fed is in the move towards raising interest rates. Obviously, as rates go up, that means the cost of debt goes up, impacts bond markets, and for countries which look to the bond market to do some of their financing, that does raise some issues on that front. The second thing that sits out there is how do the NAFTA talks go going forward? What's going to be the impact on the Caribbean? We don't know yet, but that's something that I think that has to be watched very closely. Obviously, Cuba definitely is a factor here. If there's a change in administration, that raises the question as to what is U.S. economic policy going to be towards Cuba? Does it open further? And last but not least is Venezuela. And the reason I mention Venezuela is, one, there's a question of people leaving Venezuela, which has a cost to other countries. Secondly, Venezuela's foreign exchange reserves are down under $10 billion. I think it's $9.8, $9.7 billion. The bulk of that is in gold, which makes it not terribly fungible to use to pay back debt repayments. Venezuela, despite the total economic disaster it's ended up being, has not defaulted on their debt. But the question is, going forward, what happens if Venezuela defaults? Does Venezuela call in its remaining loans to Central American and Caribbean countries to try and make those payments going forward? So Venezuela definitely is something that sits there it's hard to figure out the exact impact, but boy, it could hurt the region.
With respect to energy, I think, which is where you'd want me to focus for a minute, I think there are going to be some tremendous finds in the Guyana-Suriname Basin, the GSB. As I said, Guyana is seeing a lot of exploration by Exxon, now by Tullow Oil, by a number of other companies. In the case of Suriname, they haven't hit any big deep water well as yet, but the Zadius well, which came about in 2015. That was a big find, but for some reason, Shell has not exploited it in the way in which it should, I think because of the depression in oil prices. But Suriname is going to emerge in a very big way with an oil story, certainly in the very near future. Secondly, I think one of the important points is that probably in, I don't know, in a month or two, Trinidad and Tobago will release a national energy policy. Now, it has never done that, although it's the 6th largest producer of LNG in the world, and and is a mature oil economy. It has never done that. But a lot of us were working on that over the years, if Mr. Dukaran remembers, and it's about to come to light. And what I think it will do is provide an architecture for regional energy policy, specifically not only for the CARICOM region, but also our neighbors in the Northwestern Caribbean, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, and others. This would be a very big step forward, particularly since the future of Venezuela is a little bit in doubt, as Scott MacDonald pointed out so very well. So I think those are the big things that we will see in a very short time. As I said, the geopolitics of energy will change quite a bit in the next few years.
Thank you, Tony. David, you want to add some of your thoughts?
Thank you, George, and again, thank you, Mike and CSIS, President Fernandez, Minister Dukaran, ambassadors. One of the key things I think we need to bear in mind, as we've seen in the review, State Department presentation, the work plan, the legislation itself, this is a mature relationship. And at least in many of the fronts, a very successful one over the past 5 decades. The Caribbean Basin Initiative is probably the most successful trade and investment relationship the U.S. has, particularly with a non-free trade agreement country, in terms of exports, in terms of trade, in terms of foreign direct investment. And it would be remiss if we don't remember that the Caribbean side and the business, trade, and investment side of that relationship came about because of on the one hand, the offer from President Reagan, but on the other hand, the engagement, the demandeur aspect of it from Prime Minister Seaga in Jamaica and Prime Minister Charles in Dominica in 1981 to focus not on the bullets, which was the component of the original CBI with Central America, if you remember, but on business, on trade. I think we need to remember that because the U.S. Caribbean relationship has a very good existing toolbox already. We've heard about it on energy, on the security front, on trade and investment. We have a trade and investment framework agreement. The challenge is, what do you do with those tools? And there's been a lot of discussion with the legislation and the State Department work plan that, oh, there's no new money, oh, there's nothing new. Well, the challenge is, what do you do with the tools that are there in order to leverage this into the future? We've heard already there's a review, a ministerial on CBSI in the Dominican Republic, so that's a critical point of engagement on the security front. There will be a ministerial in Miami in November, which we're working on to package together with our annual Caribbean Central American Action Miami Conference on the Caribbean and Central America. Again, a point of engagement for the region to say, these are initiatives which we can take. And we just heard a CODEL to various countries, something that hadn't happened in various years. So I think there's a sense that it's not just on the U.S. side. The region has to take a degree of co-responsibility to say, what are we going to do to engage and to leverage the tools that are in place? Otherwise, what's going to happen is our friends at the State Department, at Commerce, who have to deal with, I think it's 204 countries in the world now, they're going to have to go to the next set of engagements that the U.S. has to do. So I think there's a very privileged position for the region. The efforts here, CSIS, what the private sector is doing, the diaspora engagement for this legislation has been really amazing. You've had visits to Washington from all over the United States of the Caribbean American diaspora engaging with Congress and with the administration. There's a need to really focus on leveraging that in these various areas if there's going to be success. I'm just going to quote from a higher pay grade than myself. The Caribbean Development Bank just came out with a statement yesterday regarding issues on the Barbados economy. And just to quote the sentence, there's a lot of projects in the region that are not finding their way to completion. This has resulted in an implementation deficit, which is the case not only in Barbados, but in the Caribbean as a whole. The director, Dr. Ram, said, in the Caribbean, we spend too much time on planning and thinking and not enough on implementation. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, David. You're quite right in reminding us two important points. One of them is the challenges of policy in the Caribbean and U.S. relations with the Caribbean is not the absence of policies and instruments. It's the issue of how to synchronize and coordinate all of them into a set of even bigger and more effective targets and achievements. Let me open it up now for discussions. If you could just identify yourself, and if you wish, kind of point in which direction of the panelists you want to go. Why don't we start in the front here? Bruce.
Hi, Bruce Segueras, Berliner Corcoran Row. First of all, congratulations to CSIS for putting together this program and the study. One observation that hasn't been really discussed is the role of states in the United States and the need for the Caribbean to engage with states. So there's a few issues that they could do that. One is tourism. So for instance, state of California has an agreement, tourism agreement with Mexico and an MOU with Israel. The southeastern states have a lot in common with things like plantocracy tours, sports that they could be doing with the Caribbean. Another area is we've heard about the SUNY program with UWI. I mean, the state universities are enormous. You know, states like Texas, California, there could be all kinds of things done between the Caribbean and states. And then the third area is financial services. And that's not a good area because the Caribbean has lost a lot of their markets to South Dakota, Nevada, Wyoming, and Delaware because they're not following international standards. On the other hand, some of those same states require companies to make unitary accounting when they're doing business in so-called tax havens. In the Caribbean countries are again being punished because they're on these lists. But to deal with that requires engaging the federal government and international organizations. I'll stop there and invite any comments from the panel.
Thank you, Bruce. Scott, maybe you're the first one.
Yeah, no, Bruce, it's a very good point. I mean, one of the issues that comes up is there's a lot of business out there on the financial side for corporations, trust, everything. It's great to go to a location where you do not have to disclose who the ultimate beneficiaries are. And a lot of U.S. states offer just those services. The flip side of that is if you're looking at Financial Action Task Force reports, Caribbean countries are criticized if they try to conceal who the beneficiaries are. And there's also an image issue which comes up is, you know, the Caribbean's a fun place for rum, fun in the sand, and bank secrecy. And it's a stereotype, and it's been a very negative one in terms of how Caribbean countries get treated. But that is one of the issues going forward that really does need to be addressed, because for the U.S. to have rules and regulations, to sign international agreements, and then turn around and allow a certain amount of largesse with the state governments, that's something that needs to be addressed. Absolutely.
Let's take some more questions. Yes, sir.
Hi, Max Trujillo. There's been a couple of issues that I wanted to follow up that have been raised, particularly regarding China. I'm glad that people are monitoring, but the question is the U.S. government taking a proactive view on how to address the vacuum that obviously the Chinese and the Russians are seeing in terms of U.S.? The U.S. now has to understand that the Caribbean are allies and partners, and not view the region a paternalistic point of view. But how do they engage to make sure that we don't have Chinese and Russian fleets going in and out of the Caribbean region, creating some sort of tension within us? Also, you mentioned Cuba. Do you think that the Cuban government will have the foresight of using this opportunity to create a transition government as defined by the Libertad Act or the Helms-Burton Act, and creating a series of events that will allow the U.S. President, Congress to lift some of the sanctions and engage more in terms of the business situation with Cuba? Finally, for David, if there's going to be a reopening or a rediscussion of CAFTA, DR, do you see an engagement regarding how to engage Puerto Rico directly in that new conversation? Thank you.
Let's hold off a little bit on those thoughts and just take one or two more questions. Let's go to the back of the room.
Thank you. Many thanks to CSIS and to the speakers and authors. Just thinking about the sort of three strategic areas that you've highlighted, there's of course an interdependency amongst them. We see that Caribbean countries have the triple trap, if you will, of natural disasters, high fossil fuel prices, which provide very high electricity costs in the region. And of course, all of these things contribute to a very high debt overhang. The World Bank studies have shown that high levels of indebtedness correspond with those factors. I think there'll be no silver bullet to how we deal with all of these things, but it seems that the energy issue and the challenge we face with energy has an impact on two things. One is the geopolitical security sphere, and also it has an impact on our economies. And of course, when there isn't enough economic opportunities, and I'm coming to the question, when there isn't enough economic opportunities, then there's sort of people resort to crime and violence, and you have those sort of security challenges. While there's no silver bullet, it seems to me that we do need to think about a grand bargain around the energy nexus. What is happening in Guyana and Suriname now, excellent, but these are just two countries. And from a geopolitical point of view, it's one country, one vote, and a lot of the votes, if you will, are in smaller countries that do not have access to energy and have to have had to strike up all sorts of relationships to overcome those things. So I'm just wondering, in the context of HR 4939 that's being discussed, how can we give greater focus to the energy sector to actually be able to show progress year after year? It seems to me that if we can get momentum on that energy issue, we could deal with a large part of the economic issues and some of the geopolitical security issues. So I was just wondering whether there's any thoughts on the emphasis we need to give to energy. Of course, we've got to deal with everything, but we do need to find a way to focus, I think, in order to be able to demonstrate some momentum on this new relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Thelma Philip Brown, St. Kitts and Nevis. Thank you, CSIS, and I trust that the next time I'll see more women represented and more youth. And the church, if you're dealing with the Caribbean, you have to include the women, the youth, and the church. So, I just wanted to say, excellent papers. I read them, but I felt a little bit down. I'm looking at all the issues and all the problems. And I reminded myself, and Mr. Lewis just said that we don't have enough implementation, too much talk. I reminded myself that the Caribbean region is the first region to eliminate, in the world, to eliminate measles. We have the country now who has eliminated mother-to-child transmission of HIV. We've eliminated polio and rubella syndrome. And yet we have health and education at the bottom of this six, and we don't focus on it. For a small country like St. Kitts and Nevis, our main resource is our people, human and social development. The first 6 sustainable development goals speak to human and social development. And I wonder if we can find a way, I know in this engagement is better if you have 2 healthy people in a relationship, and you can't find a way in HR 49 to get the engagement down to the small building blocks, building our human and social capital. There were studies done in King's College, Duke University, and the University in New Zealand. They followed 1,000 children from childhood till they were 38 years old. They found, and it I think is the Patico principle or something, that 80% of the problems caused by 20 of any, or 80% of the results, 20% of causes. And what they found that those children, 80% of the social problems, crime, drugs, whatever, came from 20% of these people, and they could have been predicted at age 3 by their brain health and development. And so it is important that while we talk about all these issues, it comes down to human and social development and investing early on. And I'm just asking, how can we do that? Because whether it's energy, security, is corruption, is bad governance, whatever it is, it boils down to that building block, the individual, the family, the community before the nation. Okay.
We're going to do a kind of wrap-up response from our 3 panelists and demonstrate how good they are. Evan, you want to start? We actually had sort of 3 packages of thoughts here, one involving, well, specifically there was Cuba, there's China, that kind of domain. There was the grand bargain concept over there, and then in case we hadn't even broadened the subject even further, a rather relevant issue involving human and social development. Absolutely. Evan?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the question. And I've been following China and Latin America for about 14 years now, and I've seen from the time when Roger Noriega was Assistant Secretary of State for the Hemisphere, through Arturo Noriega, Roberto Jacobson, there's been a consistent, really bipartisan reluctance to try to keep China explicitly out, or at least tell our Latin American partners who they can and cannot engage with. Having said that, I think there's an excellent opportunity with the implementation of this new House resolution to think in new and creative ways about what our strategic posture is. And indeed, having said that, 2 things I think that make the Chinese engagement, there are opportunities clearly for the Caribbean to benefit from Chinese investment. However, on the one side, there are governance impacts, and on the other side, many of the impacts, the negative impacts, are frankly outsourced to the United States if those investments and other projects go wrong. Those negative impacts are not outsourced to China or to Russia or to others, and so we have an extra stake in that. Having said that, I believe that there are particular things that the U.S. should do, and I think number 1 is when we think about engaging as the partner of choice, we need to focus on better leveraging the private sector things that we do. Access to U.S. tourism, markets, investments, and indeed the way that we deal with remittances, I think are important tools, especially in an era where money is limited. Number 2, I think it's absolutely imperative that we continue our strong security engagement. As we see, there's competition for security as well as other engagement. So I think, again, the continuity of CBSI funding, and also taking a closer look both at this year's National Defense Authorization Act and the coming year's Act, which actually creates some potential difficulties for how we engage with the Caribbean in the security realm. Number 3, what I would say diplomatic attention with our partners regarding the types of relationships that they have with certain actors, such as China and Russia, which I think is important. Number 4, specifically, what we do with respect to Venezuela and Colombia strongly impacts the Caribbean. The flows of guns, the flows of narco-trafficking, the flows of people. It's not just a Andean matter, it is a Caribbean matter, us solving or helping to solve these problems. Number 5, I think we need to have a better strategic vision and analysis. Unfortunately, you have Bahamas under NORTHCOM, you had the rest of the Caribbean at SOUTHCOM, and oftentimes there's just a lack of willingness to see the Caribbean as a globally interconnected region that also is affected by what happens in Colombia, by Mexico, that deals with Europe, that deals with India, that deals with China. I think we need to get that part better. The Dominican Republic, there is a great opportunity. This year, the leadership of the Conference of American Armies passes from the United States to the Dominican Republic. We, as the partner with the Dominican Republic, have a vested interest in helping the DR get that right, and also helping the Dominican Republic to showcase important Caribbean issues as part of the region, having to do with the situation in Haiti, having to do with transnational drug and migrant flows, and other things. We also have a greater interest in cooperating with Europe, and also in cooperating with certain partners outside of the region, for example, India. Ironically, India, especially with Prime Minister Modi, like the United States, probably suffers from a combination of personal ties and diplomatic reluctance to more aggressively engage the region. But I think there's more that we can do there to help build the type of bridges, to help build the type of institutions and prosperity that are important in the Caribbean, and in that way, not try to exclude others such as China, but to position the United States as the partner of choice, which, after all, we are connected by about 3.5 million people of Caribbean descent in this country. So, thank you.
Thank you. Before moving to Tony and David, Scott, you want to take up some of the good ambassadors' questions and thoughts?
Yeah, no, I thought it was a very good question. I mean, the social dimension in the Caribbean, like here in the United States, is quite important. I think the response, or the policy response that you need, and some of this is addressed in the bill, U.S. government bill, is, you want things such as encouragement of small, medium-sized businesses. You want a way for them, it goes back to the issue that there's credit out there, but also the issue of engaging part of the population. Certainly, micro-lending is something that should be thought of and used. It's been used in a lot of other developing countries, and that's been a very important part of it. Women's cooperatives have also been something that's been used very usefully, and if you have a women's cooperative, it's easier as an organization to go get a loan than it is by yourself for business enterprise. The other aspect I think that's very important here, and this is an issue all governments face with the budgetary process, is how much money do you put aside for social policy, and in particular health. And we've had issues, the Zika virus has been one thing, hasn't been mentioned today. It does not help the local population to be unhealthy. At the same time, it doesn't help with promoting a particular region for business. It doesn't help for tourism. So there also has to be, I would say, an ongoing commitment to healthcare policies in each of these countries. And one thing which I did touch upon earlier is education. You brought up the educational issue. It's critical. Anybody here that's in the job market in the United States knows that you have a changing landscape, it's radically changing. And new skills are needed badly if you want to get a job in this environment. And the Caribbean sits in a competitive environment like everybody else. Those job skills in the Caribbean, old ways of doing things, have to be reassessed. And it goes back, someone brought up e-commerce, but that's something that requires technical knowledge. And those are the things I think need to be promoted to help all the way from where the child is brought into the world as to how they go into the job market and society. That's my humble opinion.
Thank you, Scott. Tony, you want to address some of the energy-related issues?
First of all, let me thank Ambassador Friday and the ambassador from St. Kitts and Nevis. Nice to hear Caribbean voices, obviously, times like this. because you're the ones who have to really enunciate the policies on behalf of the government. I only hope that sometime the leaders in the region could be as perceptive as some of the ambassadors tend to be. With respect to the grand bargain in energy, Ambassador Friday, there is every reason to have that. You know, how you go about it is the question. Let's look at the current energy picture. Let's take a roadmap, for example, with respect to an emerging country like Guyana, with respect to petroleum. Sometimes the above-ground issues, as we say, are really critical. In the case of Guyana, we're talking about border disputes, with Venezuela and Guyana and Suriname, environmental degradation, biofuels mitigation against climate change. You have non-technical risks that stem from environmental and community concerns. Institutionalized weaknesses, I think, or institutional weaknesses. The possible marginalization of indigenous peoples, you know, with respect to certainly Guyana and Suriname. And all of these things tend to ignore some constituencies and empower others. I think in getting to the grand bargain, one of the things we have to do regionally is to look at the potential for distribution of revenue from energy rents. This has been really a problem. I'm speaking here, the governor of the central bank here in Trinidad, he was in charge of the, you know, the sovereign wealth fund for many years. And Trinidad found a way to distribute that. They distributed it by ensuring that the price of gas remained subsidized. They ensured by making sure that education was free, that hospitalization was free, that a number of things were subsidized. That's how some of the wealth was dispersed to the population. We became a quote-unquote socialist society. Now, I didn't understand that. Let me just tell you, for example, when Hugo Chavez declared 21st century socialism and was giving away the Venezuelan largesse, I made a rather obscene statement one day by describing this 21st century socialism as an economic theory caught somewhere between Simón Bolívar and Santa Claus, because that's what it was. You know? So I think we have to be careful as to how we proceed with these things. The point I wish to make is that energy revenue earned, the public and the leadership in the region have to understand that this must transcend political cycles and generations. And abundant natural resources will do very little to help the regional community at large in terms of economic development unless you are willing to address the management issues, unless you're willing to, in fact, address the political factors that may conflict with sound policy choices. This is where the dilemma is, you know, what the political leadership wants to do and what should be done in terms of the public at large. I think that's where the grand bargain has to come in, somehow or the other, between all countries.
We've actually run way over time, but none of you have left, so we'll continue. David, I think, is going to bring this discussion to a close. I think you've got a couple different observations you want to make.
Right, since we had a few questions. Thank you, George, and everyone for the patience. This is a good sign for a first launch of the report, so congratulations to all of you. The U.S. government, Max, has already said that they're reviewing all trade agreements. And some of us in the trade policy wonk business were having a big debate. Does that just mean free trade agreements? Does it mean preferences? So we shot an email to USTR, and they said all agreements. That means CBI, which is a preferential trade program. If you want to get sticky about it, it's not a free trade agreement. It means the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which is another trade preference program. It means GSP, which is our general system of preferences. So it's everything. And specifically on that, we had the U.S. ITC review of the CBI in May, and they had to cancel the hearing because there were only 2 submissions from 2 embassies. Nobody else came forth. They took them privately. They're doing their report, which is due in September. So engagement, that's all I can say on that. We have the USTR Trade Enforcement Report. Comments are due July 31st, which is Monday. And the USTR has announced their annual CBI review, which comments are due September 15th. So again, engagement as to that process. Puerto Rico participated strongly, as you know, in the Dominican Republic component of the CAFTA-DR, hosted a round of negotiations, and worked hard in Congress, you were there as a staffer, to ensure that there was a vote of support, precisely because, as Bruce mentioned, the state-level interest, for those of you who don't know, the state territory of Puerto Rico, USA, depending on which time of the year, the #1 trade-in partner is either Dominican Republic or Colombia. So there you have a very strong vested interest, much similar to Texas and Mexico, although probably only about 3% of that volume. So I think that's important in terms of that sense. And also another piece of info, of all this CBI trade we're talking about, we also have to, there's a nuance. 60% of that 21 billion is the Dominican Republic. And then the rest are all these other beneficiary islands. And on foreign direct investment, about 30% is Dominican Republic. So we need to qualify that in terms of that relationship. With regards to the energy engagement, well, we have an energy ministerial in Chile in September. And Chile is pushing a big focus on renewables. So I would like to think that Caribbean countries are focusing on that as a component to say we need to be there with a program that's been bipartisan. It started with the Bush administration. It continued with the Obama administration. The Trump administration has not said it will discontinue it. So as far as I'm concerned, that means let's engage with that. And that's an important component. There is a private sector component to the energy ministerial through the Americas Business Dialogue. We just had a conference call yesterday. Only 2 companies from the CARICOM region, one from Barbados, one from Trinidad and Tobago. We ought to have at least 7, if not all 14, 1 company minimum speaking about energy and the private sector in that engagement. And to add to that, we have an annual Trade and Investment Framework Agreement with the United States. It hasn't met for 2017 because we only just had a USTR 2-3 months ago. Engagement. CARICOM needs to make sure that meeting takes place this year. And by the way, in trade jargon, energy is a service. So we need to make sure energy fits into that framework. Ambassador from St. Kitts, completely on target. I've always argued, as we always say, Barbados is usually #2 or #3 on the Human Development Index, globally speaking, so there's something there, and you multiply that for the rest of the region. Education and health is a critical investment component of that. I don't like using the word cost because it isn't. It's an investment. We need to look at it as an investment. And 2 of the 6 areas of the strategic engagement plan are health and education. It's not the forte of what CSIS is doing, but we clearly acknowledge it's something to engage in. And it goes to the heart of competitiveness in a region in which, pick any country, 75% of the economy is services, most of them is 95%. The Dominican Republic, which is a manufacturing powerhouse, last year's data, 68% of the Dominican Republic economy is services. So things are happening in this region which are all linked to knowledge-based development, which we need to exploit. Finally, this is our initiating move, if you will. This report, we're going to launch a work plan for the rest of the year, 2018. Our message to all of you and everyone else is, come to us.
Sit down with us to discuss what aspects of this engagement process can we work with CSIS on to see how we can get traction here in Washington, but also back in the region, because this needs to be leveraged in region if it's going to be successful. So I think I can speak for Michael and for the institution. We are open to engaging with you at all levels. We have a certain area of forte and competitiveness, but that doesn't mean we can look at it broadly, just as we did when the State Department came to us and when colleagues on the Hill came to us. That's part of the mandate now for this program. So we thank you for that engagement and look forward to you coming to us on that.
I'll just add to David's concluding remarks that we actually are contemplating a number of more specific country initiatives, country programs rather, meetings early this coming fall. Some focused on the Southern Caribbean. Suriname, for example, which rarely gets really any attention here in Washington, is one of them. I'm seeing Mark Schneider in the back of the room here, who's one of the senior associates here, also here at CSIS, contemplating a program on, in fact, kind of the implications of the end of the UN peacekeeping mission in Haiti. So a lot of the report, much of the report really is on broad regional themes, but we also are going to be delving into country-specific issues, which I think is also important in really understanding the specifics of how the region ultimately comes together and U.S. policy addresses those concerns. So thank you very much. Good.